Hello and welcome to part two of the voice lecture for chapter two. So we ended up by talking about what happens if there are two markets where the same product is sold and these two markets are in different countries. If no trade is allowed to occur, then basically the price difference between the two countries persists. However, if the two countries open up to trade, then clearly the country where the cheaper priced product is going to export it to the country where the more expensive priced product is. So trade will occur. And that trade will occur because of arbitrage. So arbitrage is buying something in one market and reselling it in another market to profit from a price difference. So that'll occur until the prices are equalized in both markets. And, with no trade, you would have, if there wasn't any movement of the goods from one market to the other, then of course, there wouldn't be any trading occurring, and the price difference would persist. But if the markets open up to each other, so the countries open up to each other, then obviously trade will occur. So you get international trade in a product such as motorbikes. It's going to cause the price to fall in one country. And we're going to see it's actually going to cause the price to increase in the other country. So how do we characterize this in our supply-demand diagram? Well, the way in which we look at it is that if we have a given price and there's an excess demand for the good, so in other words, demand for the good exceeds the domestic supply, then that implies that there's going to be imports. On the other hand, if you're in a country where the supply of the good exceeds the demand, so excess supply, then that implies that that country is an exporting country. We're going to see that in some of the diagram here. So let's go over this. Let's say the US is on the left-hand diagram, the international market is the middle diagram. So in the international market, we've got to have that demand equals supply. So that's kind of the basic thing to understand. Now, if we're importing from another country, if we end up importing from another country, which we do with motorbikes, then it makes sense that somewhere else in the world, they are supplying more product than the domestic consumers are demanding. So let's have a look at the diagram on the left. The original price in the US for motorbikes was $2,000. That's where domestic supply equals domestic demand. However, if we open up to trade, what's going to happen is the price in that country is going to fall from $2,000 to where the world equilibrium price is, and we're going to find out that it's at $1,000. And the rest of the world, just think of the rest of the world as one country. So in diagram C there, you can see that the original price was $700. So it was a lot cheaper in that country. When we open up that country to the rest of the world, it actually causes the price to rise in that foreign country. So to go from 700 to 1,000. And they end up producing more than their domestic consumers want. So there's an excess supply. That represents exports. That gap where it says exports in the right-hand diagram must equal the gap in the left-hand diagram A, where it says imports. So whatever's exported from that foreign country, it's our imports that come into the US. Okay, so hopefully you understand what's going on here. There's when you open up to trade, there's obviously an arbitrage opportunity. That's going to be taken by some merchants, and what's going to happen is that the price is going to, remember these are identical goods by the way, so the price is going to converge on an international price where demand in the whole world equals supply in the whole world. And that's the middle diagram B. So what are the effects of trade on the well-being of producers, consumers, and the nation as a whole? Now we have to go back to our welfare measures that we used for consumers, which was consumer surplus, and our welfare measure that we used for producers, which was producer surplus. So if you look what's happened in the first diagram, what's happened is that originally we had producer surplus that was in blue, C. That was, sorry, consumer surplus that was C. What's happened now is that price has come down considerably. It's come down to 1,000 from 2,000. So consumer surplus has expanded by A plus B plus D in there. So total consumer surplus is now A plus B plus C plus D. That's the area under the demand curve at the current price. So consumers are benefiting by that amount. What about US suppliers? Well, they were having a producer surplus of A plus E. Now that the price has come down, they are going to be worse off by the area A. They're going to lose that producer surplus. So, in the domestic market, we can say that the consumers are better off by A plus B plus D, but the US producers are worse off by A. Okay, so what's the net effect? Well, it's A plus B plus D minus A. So A goes in and it comes out. So the net positive for US consumers is going to be, or for the US market as a whole, is B plus D. That's the benefit. When we look at the rest of the world, what's happening there? So go over to diagram C. Well, the rest of the world, you're going to see prices were at 700 for motorbikes and they've now risen to 1,000. Who's benefiting here? Well, for consumers, it means that the prices of the motorbikes have gone up. So they're only going to demand 25 when they were demanding 50 before. So their consumer surplus will have dropped by J plus K. So they'll be out by J plus K. So that's going to be a negative for that foreign country's consumers. What about the producers? Well, the producers are going to be up by J plus K plus N. So the net benefit in the foreign country is going to be J plus K plus N, that's to the producers, minus J and K, which is the consumer surplus loss. So that's loss to the consumers. So the net there is N. So for the foreign country, they're better off by that area N. Now in the middle diagram, we can represent that in terms of the imports and exports that are occurring. And we know that the imports and exports come to 50. Now you can see that from the first diagram as the gap between point B and point C. So that's the imports, in other words, the excess demand at that world price. So that's going to be 65 minus 50, which is 50. So in the middle diagram, you can see that is the amount that's imported. It's also the amount that's exported. So if we go over to the right-hand diagram, you can see that 75 is the amount now produced by those foreign producers. 25 of them are demanded by domestic consumers. So the rest of the amount, 75 minus 25, which is 50, can be exported, and they are exported. And that's the 50 again that comes up in the diagram in the middle. So what's the gain here? The gain in terms of the supply of exports. So here the diagram in the middle is a little bit different because it's the supply of exports and the demand for imports. So that area N there, again, is exactly identical to the area N in the diagram C there. So that's the producer's extra producer surplus that the producers have gotten in the foreign country from trade occurring. Now, what about the consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus from the imports in the US will be B plus D. We know that that's the net benefit anyway from the imports into the country. So that consumer surplus from imports is B plus D. So that kind of shows you what's going on. Now we can look at this in terms of a table. So we can get actually the net effect for the whole world if we wanted to. So, you know, this just summarizes what we've seen already. So you can see the consumer surplus there for the US with free trade, producer surplus. If we had no trade, we'd only earn C, and the producers would earn A plus E. So the surplus would be C plus A plus E. So the net effect, the net positive effect, is B plus D. We talked about that earlier. The net positive for the rest of the world is N. You can see that on the right-hand side of the table. What have we shown here, though? These are all just areas, and you're probably saying, well, so what? Well, what we've shown is that if the countries trade, both of them are better off. Both of them are better off by an amount that we can identify graphically. So in other words, trade is benefiting both parties, both the foreign country. You can see who it's going to. In the foreign country, it's the producers who are benefiting, who are benefiting more than the consumers are losing. And in the domestic country, so that's the US, it's the consumers who are benefiting more than the producers are losing. So it's the consumers benefiting in the US, it's the producers benefiting in the rest of the world. And when we add those two together, we can see that the gains from trade across the world will be B plus D plus N. So when we shift from no trade being allowed, by the way, international economists have a word for that, for no trade. It's called autarky. So if you're an autarkic country, like North Korea, for instance, then you do very little trade with the rest of the world. But if we move from no trade to free trade, we can see what's happened. It's lowered the market price in the US. It's raised the market price in another country, you know, wherever it's going to be the exporting country. So the decrease in price will benefit consumers, and the decrease in price will reduce producer surplus. So in the domestic country, so that's the US, it's consumers who are the net beneficiaries. And the net gain for the US, we worked out, is B plus D. Now, in the exporting countries, it's exactly the opposite. We went through the areas there. The exporting country gains from the trade, and the net gain from the trade is equal just to that area N, and that goes to the producers. The question arises, you know, which country gains more? Well, in our diagrams, it was clear that the producer surplus going to the US exceeded consumer surplus going to the US exceeded the producer surplus going to the foreign country. So, you know, one way of looking at this is to look at the gains from opening trade to the, you know, in terms of the rest of the world's gain. So in that case, it would be X divided by Y. In our case, that would be B plus D divided by N. Obviously, you know, this is a stylized example considering motorbikes, so you can't always say that the domestic country benefits more than the foreign country, but in this case, clearly in terms of that area, it does. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it can be the foreign country that benefits more than the domestic country. What is the actual result if we do a lot of math around this? Well, the result is that in fact, the side with the less elastic, the less steep trade curve, so less steep import demand curve or export supply curve, gains more. So the gainer will be the one with the less elastic so the steeper demand curve or supply curve. And that's just a result, and we're not going to show that, but if you fiddle around with the demand curve for exports, or the supply curve of the imports from the diagram here, here B, in other words, you'll see why that's the case. Now let's go back to that B and just check that it's true here. So the curve that's less elastic, well, which is the steeper in the figure B? Is it demand curve or the supply curve? It's clearly the demand curve. So therefore, that's going to be the country that's demanding it that's going to benefit more. That's the US, and that's therefore why that triangle there, labeled B plus D, is clearly bigger than the triangle labeled N. So it's the US that'll benefit more from the trade than Indonesia, Indonesia or wherever these bikes come from. Hopefully that's clear. And that concludes this chapter. So thank you very much for listening to it, and have a great rest of your day.